All right. Should we get going?
Yeah.
Well, welcome everyone to session 2 of the Color of Law Book Club, put on by Urban Land Institute, ULI Louisiana, and ULI Triangle. We're very excited to have you guys here again for our second session of 3. We wanted to quickly thank our annual sponsors for ULI Louisiana. We couldn't do this without you guys, and likewise the sponsors for ULI Triangle. And I'm going to introduce our facilitators today. We have Anita Brown Graham. She is the professor, or a professor of public law and government at UNC Chapel Hill, and leads the NC Impact Initiative, which is a special initiative to expand the school's capacity to work with public officials on complex policy issues. And her work supports communities working on economic mobility, poverty, expansion of pre-K, and extending the labor pool, and opioid misuse and abuse. And she will be joined by Chris Tyson, who is the Newman Trowbridge Distinguished Professor of Law at LSU, president of and CEO of Build Baton Rouge, and he teaches and writes in areas of property, real estate development, local government, law, and land use and development. So with that, I think we're just going to jump right into it today. And Chris and Anita will get started. We're kind of keeping today's session a little bit more interactive, so we will have some reaction questions for you to respond to in the chat. And we'll put those up as it becomes appropriate. But I think with that, I'll leave it to you guys.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. Hey, Anita, you there? I think she's on mute. You're on mute, Anita.
I'm here and I'm excited to be with you, Chris.
Good. Well, thanks everybody for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed our first session and that you're continuing to enjoy the Color of Law. We're going to tag team today's presentation. Anita and I are going to both take different chapters, and we'll have more interaction, as was explained by Nicole at the top, with opportunities for you to participate in the chat feature after each of our discussion, chapter discussions. So I'm going to begin today picking up where we left off on chapter 5, which is private agreements and government enforcement. And here in this chapter, Rothstein is introducing us to what I think is a pretty well-known aspect of the structure of housing discrimination throughout the 20th century in the United States. I think for many of you, the scope and the range of policy devices deployed to racially discriminate in housing throughout the country is probably more than you thought existed, but I suspect that all of you have some familiarity with racial covenants, right? Deed restrictions in the title to real property that restricted the sale or transfer of that property to persons on the basis of race and oftentimes religion and national origin. These covenants were commonplace around the country. And they were a key feature in property law, as in the earlier part of the 20th century, property law in the US evolved to allow for people to make agreements in the transfer of property that would inure to, or that would obligate the future purchasers to maintaining those conditions on that property, that it would run with the land, so that we say, so that putting a restriction in place was a way for a seller to control the future character of property as it was transferred through successive owners, and in the course, in the sense of a neighborhood, right? That we could control the character of neighborhoods by binding all of the property owners to a certain set of agreements and mutual obligations that would kind of tie them together and produce this linked fate that we've all got to protect our property value in the character of our neighborhood, and not only through these kind of social arrangements and agreements, but by putting that into codifying that into the deeds that that represent our ownership in making sure that that lasts going forward. This is quite possibly one of the most notorious aspects of housing discrimination in American law, and certainly existed in every state and proliferated as the modern housing developments of the 20th century begin to take hold, and issues around property values and neighborhood character and risk mitigation, all of which is related to the federal structures of mortgage underwriting that we're learning about in the Rothstein book. All of this relates together, right, to create a specter of risk, a threat, and linked fate, particularly among white homeowners who, above all, know, as you see in some of the excerpts in the chapter, that the greatest risk to their property values and thereby their middle class status, their ability to build wealth and transfer it intergenerationally, their ability to enjoy a good life, to keep their families safe, all of the things that we associate with home, right? One of the most personal constructs that we have in law and society, right, is the home. And so all of that is wrapped into the lens that these owners will go to protect those property values. And the singular threat that they are facing is, as it is called, infiltration, right, by other racial groups, particularly African Americans, although we know looking at racial covenants around the country, we frequently see references to Mexicans, as Latinos were called at the time, Mongolians, as Asians were called often at the time, Jews or Hebrews, as was referred to in some parts of the country in the early part of the 20th century, even certain ethnicities of Europeans were referred to in restrictive covenants. And so, again, I see on the screen is the reference point. I think I almost got cut off when we were getting to this at the end of our last session. Again, I want to underscore, I want all of us to think about this, right? Because it is easy to kind of cast this part of history as deplorable, and it's just a bunch of racists, and I'm so glad we're done with that, right? It's much harder to look and understand how communities construct these monsters and construct these risks to these things they deem so essential to their identity, to their families, and how that is socialized into an ideology and an ethic and a set of cultural patterns that have legal force, that are consequential for all involved. And put the ad back up, please. Because I do think the ad that we saw with, that we just had up. Nicole, I don't know who's driving. Okay, we'll get back to it.
Ryan was driving that one.
Okay. So
there we go.
Again, this notion of risk that we see in this ad underscores for us the importance that is felt to keep these neighborhoods segregated. And as Rothstein documents, as we go through chapter 5, right, we have racial covenants commonplace up and until, I shouldn't say up and until, certainly beyond, but we have racial covenants in place before the 1948 Supreme Court decision in Shelley v. Kramer that outlaws racial covenants. But we know this practice continues, and we see in Rothstein's accounts of the myriad of ways that real estate associations, homeowners associations, developers, financiers, other civic associations resisted the mandate of Shelley, and even in the ways in which policy followed the decision, particularly addressing insurance, as is captured on, and appraisers, this is captured on pages 83 to 84. excuse me, not 83, 84. That's talking about the deed restrictions. After we introduce Shelley, I believe on page 88, the bottom of 87 and 88.
Chris, you're gonna get me. We are. It's gonna be like a lightning round this time. That
okay.
You're already at a minute left.
I'm already at a minute left, so that's okay. I was getting ready to bring it on. So we see here the lengths that these associations and organizations went to resist racial covenants. And we know that, as Rothstein gives us an account, it's not until 62 that Kennedy signs an executive order banning racial discrimination, but it's really not until 1968 that we get federal legislation in the Fair Housing Act passed in the weeks after Dr. King's assassination. Now, it's important to bring that current because we are still arguing over the implementation, the full implementation of the 1968 Voting Act, the Trump Voting Act, Fair Housing Act. The Trump administration has recently rolled back some of the, I think, significant advancements the Obama administration made. So this is still a point of contention, and we know that not only through reading the headlines around this very issue, but also by looking at the complexion of our communities. We see the legacy of racial covenants in residential settlements around the country. So I'll stop there. How did I do?
You did great.
You did great.
Some time left. Okay, I didn't.
You did great. I told Anita I feel like a debate moderator. Like, you have 1 minute.
It's okay. It's okay.
Fantastic.
So I know Anita is going to take some of the follow-up commentary, right?
I am. So
Okay,
the way
great.
we've organized this evening for everyone who participated in the first one, and for those of you who are new, either Chris or I will sort of take a chapter and talk through that chapter, and then the other one will give a very brief 3-minute sort of response on that chapter. So for me, first, thank you, Chris. I thought that was a really great overview of chapter 5. And I think as I was going through chapter 5, 2 things struck me as particularly interesting. The first is, and this has been true to date through the book, is the lack of examples from the South. So I live in North Carolina. I grew up in Louisiana. I went to college in Louisiana. So certainly everything that I would be ashamed to confess to happened for me in Louisiana. It's just interesting to watch these examples of restrictive covenants in the Midwest and the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest, and just kind of question, so what was going on in Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana at the time? And I think we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that later. So I'll just put a pencil point on that question. And then for me, the second interesting observation was this tightrope that government was walking between what it considered to be permissible private agreements around discrimination and then government-sponsored discrimination. And as you read through the cases, particularly after Shelley, some of them just make you go, what were you thinking? But certainly there was this intentional effort to bring the force of government to bear without leaving a fingerprint from government. And I just think that that's an interesting thing for us to think about and watch, right? So as we move into chapter 6, I think the issues that we should be interested in, and for me in chapter 6, I was really looking, as I've been looking through the entire book, for tell me something I didn't know. And I thought I knew a lot about housing policy and the history of housing policy in the country. But I am not sure that I recognized that to the points that Chris was making about private sector concern around integrated communities, that the Federal Housing Agency literally had no statistical evidence whatsoever that integration led to lower property values. Rothstein talks about a number of studies that sort of refute that claim. And I think, there are questions about those studies for sure. And in particular, I'm still trying to get my head around the notion that if you say that the policies of the FHA created a scenario in which African Americans could not move into communities of choice, and therefore distorted the supply and demand metrics such that African Americans were then willing to pay higher costs to get into communities, which meant that integration actually led to higher property values. I'm not quite sure I understand what Rothstein is saying that means for if the FHA had not been discriminatory, what the outcomes would be. But that's really not my issue. For me, the real question is this really sort of widely held narrative around private and public sector that if African Americans moved into white neighborhoods, that the property values would plummet by, one study was, not a study, but someone in a case said 50 to 75%, had no data behind that. That is just bizarre. And it's hard to imagine in 2020 that that could have been a narrative that promulgated so many policy decisions without anybody even faking a study that supported it. So for 40 years, we've been hearing this mantra, and it does not appear that there is any evidence to support it. So that, to me, felt new. And it's not that I assumed that there was good data behind the theory, but I did assume that there was some data behind the theory. And given how carefully Rothstein has captured the history of this, my sense is that if there was something out there, he would have captured that. And so can't help but shake your head about that. And then the second thing that felt new to me was the role of blockbusters. And again here, it wasn't that I didn't know about blockbusters or didn't understand the capitalistic motivations that caused them to want to scare whites out of selling their homes for less than market value and then sell them to African Americans for more than market value. That's, I totally get that. But the extent of the tactics that they used to shake up the market and distort it, that at least shocked me. So when you think about a reality in which in the city of Chicago, as one example that Rothstein gives us, 85% of the property that was sold to African Americans were sold on these contract terms where essentially these blockbusters were able to buy these homes at bargain basement prices, sell them to African Americans, not sell them to African Americans, but essentially do a lease for purchase, I think that's what we would call it now, to African Americans, in which there was no equity established from the down payment or from the payments. You had to make every payment on time for sometimes as long as 20 years before the property could be yours. It's just inconceivable that we would be talking about literally more than 8 out of 10 properties that African Americans were hoping to buy would be under these egregious circumstances. But that, of course, was the case. And then to think a little bit about the position that put these African American buyers to be in, where they were then forced to sublet the properties so that they could make sure that they made the payments, because they understood that one late payment would mean they would be out of the property with no equity investment to bear, and that would have such detrimental impact on the community and on how people saw them keeping up with their property. Again, just sort of, again, not a surprise, not new, but Rothstein does such a good job of trying to explain how so many of these communities got to be in the place that they were, and for some, the place that they continue to be today. And then finally, I think no one could read Chapter 6 without being affected by his explanation about what this contract agreement meant for families and for their children. Having parents working 2 shifts and not having the ability to be around and supervise their children, and how that affected an entire generation of young people who then grew up to be adults is really troubling. And I would say the final thing that felt new to me was the nuance of trying to understand the self-fulfilling prophecy of white flight. It felt to me in Chapter 5, which Chris has discussed, that Rothstein was saying, no, like white people will not move out of neighborhoods just because Black people move in. But as you read Chapter 6, it was clear that there is this interesting juxtaposition between the irrational fear of living with people, among people who do not look like you, and this rational concern, perhaps, about what those people will mean for your property values. What's clear in Chapter 6 is that juxtaposition led to a circumstance in which, whether exploited by blockbusters or not, as African Americans moved into new neighborhoods, whites moved out.
So Anita, I think I just put it in our first chat box question to the audience as we come to time for Chris's reaction. But to everybody who's listening in, what do you think are the primary reasons for white flight?
Thanks, Natasha. I appreciate that. And so that's the question for you all, is to sort of share your thoughts about how much of it is irrational or rational. What drives that outcome? And Chris, I hand things over to you.
Yeah, that was great, Anita. I think, and I'll pick up right where you leave off just for a few top of mind comments here. At what point does the superstructure of American law, society, public policy, politics, cultural practices, resource allocation, render the irrational rational, right? Which is to say that I think what we are understanding through Rothstein's book is how all of these factors have to be considered in total because they are all part of the dehumanization of Black people, right? I grew up in the 80s, right? So if you grew up in the 80s, you know about welfare queens and you know, driving Cadillacs and crack babies and all of the things that we use to dehumanize and legitimize the stigmatization of Black poor people, their containment in segregated ghettos, right, which you know are the lineage of what Rothstein is talking about here, and the ways in which we target those communities for over-policing, over-incarceration, so on and so forth, right, as the dominant responses by the state to these set of conditions that we understand is created by the state. And so all of that exists, as I recall, you know, my childhood, in a zeitgeist that says that this is rational, that there is something about these people, their culture, their families, whatever, that must be contained, that I must have distance from, right? And there are all of these other incentives in American life to support my decision to do so. Whether I'm just red hot racist or whether I'm well-meaning, rational, you know, calculated person. And maybe that's a useless distinction in this instance, right? Because it leads us to the same place. It leads us to the same segregated communities. It leads us to the same racial wealth gap. It leads us to the same spatial inequality that we see in American cities. And so, you know, the white flight piece is important because I think we hear that term, we all know the term, right? But we think about it in these individualized terms. And I think the totality of this work is calling us to understand the superstructure of factors that incentivize, support, and subsidize these decisions. I think that was 3 minutes, so.
Yeah, no, Chris, that was perfect. If you want to, do you guys want to react to any of the y'all are doing great. Did you want to react to any of the comments in the chat box, or we can move straight into chapter 7?
Sure. I'll just, you know, I'm looking at the chat box here. What do we think are the primary reasons for white flight? Again, you know, I want us to focus, and I invite other responses, certainly. But for me, I focus on this very intricate and macro set of factors, policies, practices, decisions, so that, you know, our focus is on the whole of American life and the way that we've structured it and how all of it is conspiring against racial integration and racial equity.
And I would just respond to Jenga's point about the U.S. government creating a situation in which Black people moving into white neighborhoods would have negative impacts. Because the point that's made here is even if a white family wanted to live in an integrated neighborhood, policy was such that doing so would be a poor choice. No question about that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
Now I was going to say, in the history of blockbusting and in the history of fighting against this, you know, you do have white allies who are purchasing, you know, entering into a contract, and they get to the closing table and the Black person shows up and they assign the contract and execute, and you know, fights have ensued and all types of threats come out of that situation. That's how we integrated a lot of neighborhoods. And so there is allyship throughout this history, but it is up against a mammoth of policy and law and social practices, bureaucratic practices that are all working towards the maintenance of this segregation. And so you understand why it hasn't been undone, right? Many of those practices, as we get into in chapter 7, as Rothstein kind of brings us current to the 2008 financial crisis and the issue of reverse redlining, we understand are still, part of the pattern and practice of these issues. I think one of the things that we talk about now, and I know I live in a neighborhood that is predominantly white. We talk about the tipping point, right? Which is to say, what is the threshold of minority representation in a neighborhood that is non-threatening for whites, right? And when you cross that tipping point, that's when you start to see a white exodus. And as those property values are falling because, right, there are white buyers who don't want to live in that area. Black buyers, by design, have less capital, less equity, less access to capital, and fewer options in the marketplace. And so all of this reduces the market for the property, and then neighborhood price fall, Black people scoop up that value because, again, racial wealth gap, reduced out moving out, and those property values that hang around who aren't concerned about property value, maybe they like the neighborhood or whatnot. The Black middle class neighborhood that was the product of a period of flight. Even though I had white neighbors and who still live in that neighborhood, it was a story, right, of Black middle class uplift and white exodus that kind of produced a majority Black neighborhood in the end. And so I think we all have those stories of neighborhood transformation, particularly, if you grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and we can see that around the country. So think about that issue of the tipping point, and where is that point at which white buyers may not feel comfortable with living in a majority Black neighborhood, right? At 10%, I have Black neighbors, right? That means I'm not racist. That means I have diversity. At 30%, I'm living in a safe neighborhood. Those things are real. We know that location, race is the predominant driver of location choice with home buyers. So definitely think about with as well. How are we doing on time, Natasha?
So Chris, you might want to move on to the next chapter, but I have to say that there is a fascinating conversation in the chat around what is rational and
yeah.
And it's hard to draw that line of demarcation. So I hope people have a chance to talk a little bit more about that in the breakout sessions, right?
And maybe it's a false dichotomy, right?
Maybe. So I hear you talking about your experience, and I think in 1982, my parents bought a house in an all-white neighborhood in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And it was a painful experience for my two younger brothers, who were literally stopped every time they drove through the neighborhood. Rational, irrational? I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we could go on.
Go for it on the next one.
So Chapter 7, IRS support and compliant regulators. And Rothstein obviously continues to kind of peel back the onion for us as these chapters progress. And I think the work that Chapter 7 is calling on us to do is to think about, we talk about structural inequality, structural racism, structural discrimination, right? Structural is a buzzword now, which is a good thing, right? Because it signals our transition beyond a very individualistic focus, think about race and social relations, to one that is more concerned with systems, processes, institutions, and structures, right? So that's helpful. I think what Rothstein is calling us to do in Chapter 7 is think about the ring of institutional players that are propping up this system and what their culpability is, and how we should think about their ability, particularly with regards to tax-exempt organizations, as Ross particularly focused on here in Chapter 7, and how they utilize the favorable tax treatment of being a nonprofit to advance goals that are against policy once policy turns in a de jure anti-racial, anti-racist tone in facially. And so Rothstein wrestles with this, and I think this is helpful because, again, we're kind of expanding our focus away from just homes and neighborhoods to thinking about churches, to thinking about civic organizations and others that are in these broader processes of racial discrimination. We talk on page 102 about the IRS's obligation to withhold tax favoritism organizations and the lack of compliance or enforcement going into Brown v. Board of Education. And I think it's important to mention Brown and the role of schools. Rothstein points to the development of what used to be called, segregation academies only schools that propped up in the aftermath of Brown. Here in my home parish of East Baton Parish, where we have the distinction of having the longest, if not one of the longest, segregation lawsuits in the country, 1957 to 2002 or 3, when it was settled. When forced busing finally came to Baton Rouge in 1981, some 7,000 white students left the public school system in the year afterwards. And you can literally chart the spatial development of this city, and this is something I work on every day in my role at Build Baton Rouge. You can chart the spatial and racial stratification of this city 1981 forward, right? Which is to say that Baton Rouge's staunch resistance of the mandates of Brown from 1954 until 1981 left a delayed reaction in that we start seeing the flight patterns occur really in the 80s and 90s, when many cities experienced that in the 60s and 70s because they had adopted school desegregation much earlier. So thinking about the schools that are popping up really out of resistance to Brown, forming themselves as nonprofits, the IRS not enforcing these anti-discriminatory mandates, and these schools kind of popping up and saying, hey, we're just an association that wants to have our own school. It just so happens to happen the day after you forced us to integrate in the city. And so how do we think about that in the role of those institutions and the role of the IRS as an enforcement mechanism through tax policy for these broader public policy aims of non-discriminatory aims? So I'll stop there because I feel like I cut into my 7 minutes. Real quick, part 4 on page 109, I'd be remiss, talks about reverse redlining. Again, there's an argument that says that these discriminatory systems don't end, they just evolve, right? And that they are always with us, and this is a very durable and resilient system of discriminatory animus. And so the reverse redlining that is called out in the 2008 financial crisis, which I'm sure all of us remember, and we discovered through lawsuits waged by cities, as Rothstein captures here, through all types of analysis that's still going on, the extent to which we had predatory lending primarily to Black and Brown communities, which made them more vulnerable in the eventual crash of 2008 and losing, and this isn't just a stock market crash, this is a real estate crash, right? Your home. It's one thing to lose your portfolio, to lose your home is probably a different thing. I'm sure many of you, like me, had friends who foreclosed, right? And so we remember that time, and to think about that as not an isolated instance of market failure in 2008, but as part of a longer history of discriminating and targeting and marginalization with the aid and of the state through policy that is either non-enforced or doesn't have an appropriate commitment to non-discrimination, how that shows up even in times where we think of ourselves, right, as post discrimination or post racism when it comes to these policies. So I wanted to flag that as well, because I think it's good to help connect those dots and have us understand the policy lineage, my students in class. Let's understand the legal and policy lineage of things that we see in present day society. So I'll stop there. I'm sure I'm now over 7 minutes.
No, you guys are doing good. I feel bad having you in the discussion, especially when you to start the discussions together, because they're so great. Anita, if you want to try to keep your response to 2 minutes, but I understand if you can't, we can go into chapter 8.
I think I will actually pass on offering a response because I think Chris covered everything remarkably well. I'll go on to chapter 8 because my sense is we will want to have a little back and forth between chapter 8 and chapter 9. Yes. All right. So for me, chapter 8 was sort of almost surreal, and most of you participating this evening won't know, but at the School of Government, while I do teach law students and MPA students, mostly my job is to work closely with local governments all over the state of North Carolina. More than 14,000 of them pass through each year, and tens of thousands of other my colleagues and I for support. And I love these people. And in fact, several of my local government peeps from my own hometown are participating in the book club. So yay, Durham, North Carolina. And what I would say about the folks every day is that they are earnest and working hard to support people in their communities. That's what they communicate to me each day, every day. And maybe that's why I struggle to attack this chapter. So, as you all already know, because I've talked about my experience in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I'm from the Deep South, where we say, "So what now?" on a regular basis. And I've learned recently that that's actually city talking, because my husband, who's from a town of like 300 people in North Carolina, translates that to "do what now?" But either way, it's when you hear something that you just can't quite get your mind around. And so as I read this chapter, I had 5 moments, and I'm going to share those with you. But during that time, I encourage you to please put in the chat box whatever your "so what now" moments were after. So the first one for me was this notion that it's about money, but it's really not about money. As I read about the developer Bohannon in California, who fought tooth and nail about adjacent integrated, was willing to let housing inventory, stand unoccupied in Sunny Hills. I had one of those. So what? The same was true about the mayor who said, "We're not discriminating in this community, but we think the Ford workers track would depress property." And therefore was willing to be pressured by the developer to change the sewer costs from $100 acre to $1,000 per. What? Stop? We try to rationalize a lot of these. And one of the critiques of Rothstein's book is that he doesn't fully embrace the role that capitalism and profit play in the decision making. But when I read this stuff, it doesn't feel like it's about it. In fact, it feels as though these are people who are willing to forego profit for a principle. The second so what now moment for me is respecting in this chapter the single-mindedness of lenders, builders, realtors, and community leaders, thinking through how the American Friends Service had to go all the way to New York and use a quicker connection to find financial support for their thinking through the experience of just the first builder who tried to make that development work. First, having to go against the Santa Clara Board of Supervisors who the tract of land from residential to use to prevent an integrated community. Second, thinking through the community of Mountain View, where the builder was told he would never get the necessary approvals. Third, another town unnamed, where officials all of a sudden decided that the minimum lot size would need to be 6,000 to 8,000 square feet, knowing that that would make the project feasible. And then finally, a scenario where the seller of a fourth lot withdrew from the deal once he found out about this integrated housing plan. Like that in and of itself, all throughout the book, there are all these great examples, as Chris said, of allies, but ultimately the decision makers seemed so aligned in their need to protect their communities from integrated housing developments, that just left me going, what? So what? And then in some ways, the comparison of a meat packer, and I don't say this with any disrespect to meat packers at all, who was able to obtain a tract at Sunnyvale to build an all-Black community. So all these people's support and all these resources couldn't figure out a way to do this entity. But on the back end, someone else, because they were white, was able to sort of just go through, and as long as they weren't trying to offend the mores of the community, of the state, they could go forward. So, you know, as Rothstein says in the book, sort of taken in isolation, we can candidly dismiss state and local government devices as aberrations. But when you think about the experience of this one effort, when you consider them as a whole, it's sort of to see that they were part of a national system by which state and local governments supplemented federal efforts to maintain the status of African Americans as a lower caste. And then the second to last, so what now for me, is this statement that I've heard many, many times before, but I don't think I necessarily marry on it in the way that I should. So this is the statement of the reality of justice delayed is justice denied. And it comes up in this book that Rothstein shares about the Methodist Church in Missouri, also seeking to build an integrated community. And you just think about how many of the stories in the book reflect the courts showing up just in time. But it also causes you to pause and think about how many people the court didn't show up just in time for, and therefore they missed a window of opportunity. And then lastly, I would say I had a so what now moment about the intentional use of schools to support racial segregation in neighborhoods. This is a place where I spent a lot of time, but I'm not a historian. And so today I'm arguing about neighborhood conditions and what that means for the schools that are adjacent to. But I haven't really had reason to spend a lot of time thinking about schools got built where, and reading that part of the chapter just left me thinking, wow, none of this is happenstance. So those are my nows, and I encourage Chris to now jump in and give us some sense of what he thought about this chapter on local action, but I'm also hoping that you all will post the chat box. What was a so what now for you as you read through this chapter? Chris?
So what now? I mean, I'm with, and I think that all of those are really helpful insights. And just to be brief, because there's so much good stuff in the chat box that I want to get to. I teach state and local government law at LSU, so I'm always helping students really create the amount of agency in the implementation of federal and policy mandates and directives that occurs at the local level, right? Some scholars have called it local common law, right? The relationships and custom and power dynamics and personalities that exist in every place around the country, right? That have, in many cases, as much bearing on access to resources or your exercise of your rights as does what is on the books, right? And we see this Iverson and the Michael police involved killing that led to the Ferguson riots. The of U.S. civil rights law called Section 14141, which allows the justice to bring pattern and practice investigations against police departments to determine if there is a pattern and practice of conduct. And so this was utilized first in Los Angeles after the Rodney King riots, and it was utilized again in 2015 for Ferguson. And what did we discover? We discovered in Ferguson that there was a pervasive system of municipal extortion through the courts and the entire apparatus of local government. That was validly racist in its intent and its effect, but that existed kind of as a custom. That it seemed that the majority Black community and everyone else was just simply accepted, or at least were able to change on their own. Federal investigation, you could surmise that this would still be going on today, right? That we wouldn't know about it. How many instances of that level of kind of folksy discrimination, right, exist around the country? And so when we teach students about federalism and how federal mandates and resources, right, get devolved down to state and local levels, right? We have to contend with the enormous amount of agency that localities have in implementing federal policy, implementing federal resources, and state policy and resources as well. And so when we look at how interstates get built, when we look at how public housing gets sited, when we look at which neighborhoods get a critical infrastructure or upgrades, when we look at the places we make nice and the places that we leave behind to wallow, right? When we look at where police get deployed and where they don't, right? When we look at all that, we're talking about local decision-making. We're talking about local politics, local personalities and characters, and the people at the courthouse, the people at City Hall. All of that is involved allocating resources and making decisions that kind of actualize these broader discriminatory patterns. And so Rothstein is kind of forcing us now to zoom in and understand how these local networks, religions, personalities, customs, traditions, so on and so forth, right? How all of that is mixed up in it as well. And that's very hard to track, as the Ferguson example tells us, right? It's absent that kind of explosive situation, we might not have had that kind of spotlight on a place like Ferguson. Where else is that the case? I just told you about Baton Rouge, right? The segregation case that was settled in the 21st century. And the effects are still with us, right? And will be for a while. That's custom, right? Those are local relationships. Those are personalities. Those are people we know making decisions, spending resources and allocating them. I run the city's redevelopment authority, right? We manage the city's HUD community development dollars. And so there's a lot of local decision making that goes into how tens of dollars of CDBG, Community Development Block Grant dollars, get spent at the local level. Sure, we've got to comply with federal, but we've got these neighborhood groups, and we've got this history, we've got these political actors, and we've got the bureaucrats. And so these things are hyper local. It's helpful for us to understand the level of federal policy and at the level that it occurs on the ground. And that's what I like about this chapter. And I think now that you're getting to is that you see that people are not making rational decisions, right? They are enforcing a set of patterns and power relationships that oftentimes are more important than dollars and cents, because there's so much more invested in that. And we see that particularly at the local level. There's a saying, and I'll leave on this point, racially in cities, that, in the North, it didn't matter how high you got, just don't get too close. In the South, it didn't matter how close you got, just don't get too high. Those are talking about the spatiality of race and power, right? Which draws our attention to the ways in which localized decision-making, relationships, and power dynamics ultimately are the decider in these broader patterns of privilege, disadvantage, resource allocation, discrimination, and
I just wanted to mention real quick, I saw that Zena pointed out the ULI 1957 influence on encouraging highway systems through African-American areas. And our librarian was able to pull a copy of that newsletter for us. So we will have that in the resources folder that we'll be providing in the follow-up after this session that will go out to everybody who's been registered. Getting back to our discussion, if you guys want to jump into chapter 9, I know we're at 7 o'clock and I still want to get them to about 20 minutes of discussion questions. So if we think we can cover chapter 9 in about 10 minutes, that would be great. And then we can split out into breakouts.
Natasha, I will not do a response to chapter either, just to make sure that we don't compromise the discussion. So it's all on Chris. If they don't get to the breakouts on time, it's Chris's fault.
All right, Chris, you heard it.
I'm cutting it short because I'm ready to get to the discussion. State-sanctioned violence. This is probably the ugliest part of this because, for me, and I don't know you, there's so much the pictures and the images that we have of civil rights protests and our contemporary social movements are so telling for me. I, as a child, I was always focused not on the Black people integrating a school or a lunch counter or in the foreground, right? But the people over their shoulders, the contorted faces, the yelling, the anger. I was always fascinated that, what gets you to this point? Is it mob mentality? Is it the funny, the anger, and you look at some of those pictures, and I always wonder, where are these people today? And if I could hand them this picture, what would they think about this? How does it happen that you move into a neighborhood with your family and a mob of people your front door step, your front lawn, to not only threaten your property value, but to threaten your life, to make an example out of you, to intimidate you, to enforce, yes, how does this happen? And this is, this is easy compared to if you look at the history of lynching. That's much more stomach churning than even this. So when we look at the role of state-sanctioned violence, well, the police didn't tell them to necessarily go out here, although in some instances they actually did. But it's the selective enforcement that is the complicit factor, right? That when a mob shows up on your front lawn, your ability to call on law enforcement to protect you, your comfort in protecting yourself, right? And we live in an age of stand your ground laws, which we know are not evenly enforced, as we've seen various instances play out across the country. What allows a community, a people, and I always think that, our focus is on the bravery and the courage of the people who integrated these neighborhoods. And we always kind of, use their experiences, to kind of redeem the story of uplift and progress in America, right? And just focus on who were brave enough to do it, and yes, they burned their house down, but, yay for racial progress. But what do we say about the mob that is the police force that didn't show up, mayor and the council members who looked the other way, the people who would be responsible for sending an ambulance or the fire, all the people who didn't show up, right? Who by their absence or their silence were in full support of this. And this issue of state, that is the state sanction part, right? That Rothstein is getting to, the violence of this, the humanity of having your life threatened or participating in violence that would take life and destroy property in service of these kind of racist goals and aims. These are people that were never brought to justice, right? They are still with us. What do we do with that? And how does that impact our understanding of these issues of spatial inequality in cities where I'm 45, right? So I grew up in the last 5 decades, and I grew up in Baton Rouge, where we knew the neighborhoods around here not to go to. Right, we knew the sundown towns, as you may have heard the term, right? Places where people of mostly Black people, but also Latinos, Jews in some instances, depending on where you were in the country, knew not to let the sun go down on them being in a certain place, right? And we, to this day, places in Baton Rouge that if I hear people going to, somebody might look and we'll exchange a snicker, because it's usually someone who doesn't know the history and that, it may not be a risk for them to live there anymore. But there was a time not so long ago where it was a risk. And that certainly shapes perceptions of urban space, of local community, of risk and issues of safety, and the reach of the law. And so this issue of state-sanctioned violence, I think, is maybe one of the most difficult things to wrestle with, because in many of the legal instances, go to the courts, and obviously we can't fully go to the courts for all of this, as Rothstein gets to at the end, for recourse. But if you put that picture up, mob, in front of that house, Brian, if we have that again, these people were never brought to justice. And what is the damage that they did? How many homes were burned? How many people were maimed? How much property was lost? on top of the challenge of having to amass the resources to move into this neighborhood when you are being discriminated against in lending and in purchasing and all of that. If you finally thread yourself through that needle's eye, this is what shows up on move-in day. And for this, there's no justice, and there hasn't been justice. And so I want to pause there and wrestle with that, because it, for me, is one of the most difficult aspects of this history. Seeing this is angering. I know the lives that were impacted, because I know my parents and my grandparents and so many other people who lived through this kind of terror that was never appropriately recognized as terror, and for which there has yet to be any justice. I'll leave it there and let us go to some of the questions in the comments. And Anita, I know you said you weren't going to respond, but you certainly are welcome to revise that if you like.
No, I think that was great, and do you want us to get to the breakout so everyone has a chance to chip in verbally?
Well, Chris and Anita, thank you so much for this part of this discussion. I both know that Nicole and myself, which I'm pretty sure everyone on the call agrees with, that we have more time to let you guys go back and forth, and this is just so rich. A few ground rules to cover once again quickly before we go into breakouts. Use the book as context when possible. Be explicit about race and racism. Be kind and be mindful. With that said, Nicole is going to start our breakout sessions. You guys will have, we're at 7:09, so you'll have about 18 minutes just so we can bring you back in to close, and we'll see you then.